I recently had the chance to speak with soil and water specialist Jason Warren about some research he's doing into planting crops into raised beds.
Raised beds have been used quite a little while in irrigated production systems. They run their water down the furrows. But here, what we're looking at is using them on poorly drained soils. In northeast Oklahoma, primarily, is where we're looking right now. But what we're looking at is raised beds to minimize the influences of poorly drained soils on crops.
Right, so right here you're funneling the water basically in these channels and putting the crop right over the top.
Yeah, and what that does in these poorly drained soils in the early spring, they don't warm up as quickly as well-drained soils. And so what this bed does is create an environment for that crop row that is less wet and therefore warms up earlier in the spring. And
so allows for earlier germination.
Earlier germination. Last year we saw corn germinate about 3 days sooner on the raised beds versus some flat planted corn. This year our germination on most of our corn, we had germination about the same time, but then the rain set in, it became cooler, and the corn on the beds started to mature or go through physiological maturation much more quickly. And a month ago I was looking at those plots, and we were a full leaf on the corn ahead when we were on the beds versus the flat planted areas. And that corn just grows more vigorously on the beds because the soils are warmer and they're not as wet, but you don't really see any negative impacts as far as drought because you still have the same rooting environment. It can root down and get moisture the same as on the flat areas. It's just when it is wet, it can continue to grow, versus in the flat areas, it's aeration's not as well and the soil's not as warm. But here's a hole dug right next to a bed or a corn on beds, and you can see you have at least a good 4 inches more topsoil until you hit this clay pan down here, and you can see all those roots that is, again, go down to that clay pan and stop, and that's where we see an additional impact of raised beds. You simply get deeper soil or topsoil underneath that crop.
Now, putting this is a bit of an added cost for producers.
Yeah.
How much a difference? I guess that increase in yield and so on, is that going to pay off?
Well, last year we saw a 15 bushel, or essentially a 15% increase in our corn yields, and I think it can pay off at those increases. Of course, that depends on prices and things of that nature. But you could replace a pass with a disc or chisel with this better equipment. And in the future, right now, you know, we're in the experimental stage trying to learn how best to do it in these soils, because most of it's been done in nice loamy soils under irrigation. But the concept would be, as we move forward and learn some of the management requirements, is to move towards less and less tillage and to a more permanent bed. But we need to learn how to deal with the trash without crushing the beds and things of that nature when we start moving into limited tillage. Particularly these soils, they can be problematic to cultivate in the first place because of their high clay content. Can cause some issues with slabbing and things of that nature that you have to be careful with. And so limited tillage can be a problem because you can ruin something by slabbing it up and then have to use some pretty extensive tillage to work those clods back down.
All right. Well, it's very interesting. We'll keep an eye on this and hopefully something new for producers to use.
Yep.